Hannibal Barca, born in 247 BC in Carthage, locked in a brutal conflict with a young but ambitious Rome, which sought out to strip it of its dominance over the western Mediterranean. At first, Carthage seemed destined for victory in what appeared to be a lopsided conflict where Carthage's navy had not lost a single battle against Rome, and was living up to its reputation as the undisputed masters of the Mediterranean. Yet, within 6 years, everything would change, marking one of the most significant moments in Hannibal's life. The year was 241 BC. For 23 years now, Rome had not won a single naval battle against Carthage, and was still fighting what seemed like an unwinnable war. Yet, the indomitable young nation, still driven by the spirit of Romulus, refused to yield, despite suffering numerous setbacks, including losing entire fleets and thousands of men to violent storms. The Romans refused to be broken. Each time disaster struck, they rebuilt, learned from their mistakes, improved their tactics, and adapted their ships designs to copy the ones from Carthage. No loss was too steep, and no cost was too high, even if it meant digging in their own pockets. Roman citizens and senators alike, driven by an unyielding desire to expand their empire. This relentless perseverance would pay off in the Battle of the Agates Islands, where Rome's new fleet would pull off the unthinkable and crush Carthage's navy. Demoralized and shocked by their first naval defeat, the ruling council in Carthage quickly negotiated a surrender with Rome that would immediately end Carthage's historic claims to sell and trade in the western Mediterranean, and signaled the beginning of the end for Carthage, however slow the demise might be. No one felt the humiliation more keenly than Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca. Fresh from his successful guerrilla campaigns in Sicily, where he had harassed Roman forces, struck supply lines, and seized strategic ground, Hamilcar now watched the city's leaders bow to Rome. Enraged, he returned home only to face the mercenary war, when unpaid soldiers rose against Carthage. These twin betrayals by his enemies and his people hardened his hatred for Rome. From that moment, destroying the Republic became his life's mission, and if he would not live to see it, he would ensure that his sons would carry his vengeance forward. But before we continue, if you guys are enjoying the video so far and would like to support me and my channel, the best way you guys can do that is by buying some merch at Fighting Philosophy That Shop. Link in the description, and by liking the video and subscribing. Now back to the video. In 237 BC, just 4 years after the war had ended, Hamilcar finally convinced Carthage's council to let him sail for Spain, where he promised to raise the money needed to pay Rome's crushing indemnities. Spain, famous for its rich silver mines, offered more than financial salvation. For Hamilcar, it was an escape from the stagnant oligarchy back home, and from Hanno, the politician he believed had betrayed Carthage by surrendering so easily in the First Punic War. In Spain, free from the interference of Carthage's elites, Hamilcar could pursue his ambition without restraint. To Hanno, however, this agreement seemed ideal for other reasons. By sending his dangerous rival across the sea, he ensured that Hamilcar could neither provoke new wars with Rome nor threaten his influence with Carthage. Hannibal was barely 9 years old, the eldest of 3 sons. His younger brothers, Hasdrubal and Mago, looked up to their fathers as their hero. Hamilcar, in turn, would proudly boast to his guests, "My sons are lion cubs, reared for Rome's destruction." As the eldest, Hannibal was chosen to accompany his father on the campaign in Spain. But before any of that could happen, Hamilcar would take Hannibal to a place that would forever shape him, a place that could very well have traumatized him. According to Greek historian Polybius and Roman historian Livy, Hamilcar led his son into the temple of Baal, a place of ancient human sacrifice. Whether Carthaginians still practiced human sacrifice in the time of Hannibal is a contentious subject. What is certain is that there before the altar, Hamilcar made his son swear undying hatred of Rome as he offered a sacrifice to Baal, perhaps a lamb, perhaps a young bull. Whether or not young Hannibal fully understood the gravity of his words, the weight of the bow would grow heavier with every passing year. If Polybius and Livy record the story faithfully, Hannibal would carry the memory of this day with him for the rest of his life, recalling it even in his final years to Antiochus III, Rome's greatest enemy in the east. In a way, the child Hannibal died that day. From that moment forward, he lived for one purpose alone: to see Rome's destruction. A few short years after arriving in Spain in 237 BC, Hamilcar had achieved his goal of reviving the old Venetian silver mines. His relentless drive to pay off Carthage's enmities to Rome and build a war chest for his future conflict never wavered. Though he knew he might not live to fight the next war, he had no doubt that his 3 lion cubs would. By 235 BC, Hannibal, now 11 or 12 years old, was given a new teacher. Not a philosopher or a statesman, but a soldier. Though his name is lost to us, he was likely one of Hamilcar's trusted veterans, a battle-hardened man who trained the boy with real swords and bows, not wooden toys. Hannibal's education, however, did not stay on the training grounds. He followed his father everywhere, riding at his side on campaigns, observing strategy firsthand. While other children played, Hannibal became saddle-hardened under the Spanish sun, a skilled horseman by his early teens. From Carthage's allies, the Numidians, the most feared cavalry of their age, and later Rome's as well, he absorbed the art of mounted warfare. They taught him how to fight as one with the horse, to adapt to any terrain, and to wield speed as a weapon. From them, he mastered the feint of retreat, luring enemies into false confidence before striking with devastating force. Hannibal's lessons were not theoretical. He rode through ambushes, heard the clash of swords and the screams of the dying men, and felt the sting of arrows grazing his flesh. Scars faded, but the lessons did not. Above all, it was Hamilcar who shaped him, by example rather than words. He taught Hannibal to lead from the front, to win the soldiers' loyalty, to seize battlefields on his own terms, and to make even a smaller army seem invincible. Every moment of the boy's youth was spent towards a single purpose, the art of war, and he mastered it. Hamilcar's hard work was paying off. After years of expansion under his command, Carthage's presence in Spain was stronger than ever, but war is never without risk. In 229 BC, during what was supposed to be a negotiation with the rebellious Iberian tribes near the Ticinus River, treachery struck. The talks collapsed into an ambush. Suddenly, thousands of Iberian warriors surged from the hills, surrounding Hamilcar's men on all sides. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse. Amid the chaos, Hamilcar's mind was not on himself but on his sons. Hannibal, now 18 years old, was leading a small scouting detachment. Separated from the larger army, his younger brother, Hannibal, was with him. Hamilcar knew that if the ambush reached him, his sons would not survive. Hamilcar made a decision that would cost him his life, drawing the enemy's fury away from his sons. Surrounded, outnumbered, and refusing to surrender, he fought till the very end. The exact details of Hamilcar's death remain debated by historians. Some accounts claim that he was wounded and drowned in the Ticinus River. Diodorus Siculus places his death at the Jucar River instead. Yet, the version remembered best is this: a commander who gave his life so his sons might live. And that ending is the one most fitting to the man Hamilcar Barca was. Hamilcar was dead, but his hatred towards Rome lived on through his sons. Command did not yet fall to Hannibal, but to Hasdrubal the Fair, Hamilcar's son-in-law. Unlike Hamilcar, Hasdrubal was a diplomat and a politician first, not a warlord. While Hamilcar had expanded Carthage's rule by the sword, Hasdrubal sought to do so through alliances and negotiation. Under his leadership, Carthage's position in Spain grew steadily stronger and managed it without constant war. But while Carthage prospered, Rome was growing wary. Reports had reached the Senate that Carthage was expanding rapidly, raising armies, securing alliances, and controlling valuable resources. Some feared that this was the beginning of a second war. To prevent immediate conflict, Hasdrubal negotiated a treaty with Rome. In 226 BC, the Ebro River Treaty. Under this agreement, Carthage promised not to expand its influence north of the Ebro River. In return, Rome agreed to stay out of the Carthaginian-controlled Spain south of the river. The line was drawn. War now had only to wait. Five years after the signing of the Ebro River Treaty in 221 BC, Hasdrubal the Fair was assassinated by a slave of a Celtic king, Tagus, who sought to avenge his master's death. Command had now passed to the young Hannibal, only 26 and more than ready to lead. To his men, it seemed as though Hamilcar himself had returned in youth. They saw in Hannibal the same intense gaze, the same confidence, and the same iron will. But his resemblance to his father was more than physical. Never had there been a leader more naturally suited to command. Hannibal inspired respect and obedience without effort. He filled his men with courage, sharing their hardships and refusing any comfort denied to them. At night, he could be found sleeping in a cloak like the lowliest scout. His clothing was no different from theirs, only his horses, his weapons, and above all, his conduct set him apart. He was always the first into battle and the last to leave. Hannibal wasted no time after taking command in 221 BC. He secured Carthage's presence south to the Ebro with a string of campaigns where he crushed the Ocades, Achaei, and Carpatini tribes. But one city stood apart. Saguntum, though it laid south of the Ebro, supposedly outside of Rome's sphere of influence, the city had bound itself to the Republic's Fides, Rome's promise of friendship and protection. To Hannibal, this was a clear violation of the treaty. Still, he hesitated, knowing that siege would mean war. However, the hesitation ended when Saguntum attacked tribes allied with Carthage. With his childhood bout weighing heavily in his mind, Hannibal decided it was time to make his words come to fruition. In 219 BC, he marched on Saguntum and laid siege for 8 months. The city resisted, clinging to the hope that Rome would come, but Rome never did. When the walls finally fell, Saguntum was destroyed, its peoples killed or enslaved. In Carthage, the Senate now faced Roman envoys led by Fabius Maximus. The demand was blunt: hand over Hannibal to be punished as a criminal or face war. The Carthaginians refused, and with that, the Second Punic War had begun. Hannibal wasted no time in second-guessing what Rome's next move would be. So, he made the bold decision to bring the war straight to Rome's doorstep, not by sea, but by crossing the towering Alps. In the spring of 218 BC, Hannibal marched out of New Carthage with an esteemed 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. The first step was decisive. He led his army across the Ebro River. This was more than just a military maneuver. It was a direct violation of the treaty with Rome. Once Hannibal crossed the Ebro River, there was no turning back. The die was cast. From there, he cut through hostile Iberian tribes and pressed into the southern Gaul, subduing resistance and forging alliances at Rhone. He outmaneuvered a Roman force sent to block him, freeing his troops and elephants across the wide river and vanishing to the mountains before the legions could react. The real ordeal began in the Alps. For 2 brutal weeks, Hannibal's men battled not just enemies, but the elements themselves. The mountain passes were narrow and treacherous, paths crumbling into sheer cliffs. Freezing winds and snowstorms lashed the soldiers, many of whom had never seen snow before. Avalanches swallowed supply trains. Pack animals and men alike slid to their deaths. Worse still, hostile mountain tribes ambushed the columns from above. They rolled boulders down onto the path, showered arrows and spears into the marching soldiers, then melted back into the rocks. Fighting uphill in the ice, Hannibal's men took heavy losses. The elephants terrified the tribes, but even they struggled in the snow and ice, their massive bulk and liability on the frozen trails. According to Livy, the morale sank to its lowest. Hannibal led his men to a high vantage point. There, he pointed to the fertile plains of Italy, spread out beneath the mountains. He told them that they were not crossing the Alps simply to endure suffering, but to seize the wealth of Rome itself. The sight of Italy rekindled the resolve, and the march pressed on. By the time Hannibal emerged from the Alps into the Po Valley of northern Italy, his army was battered nearly to breaking. Ancient sources differ on the exact numbers, But Polybius claims that out of the 90,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry Hannibal had set out with, fewer than 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry survived. The elephants, once 37 strong, were reduced to just a handful. And yet again, against all odds, Hannibal had done what no one thought possible. He had dragged an army across the highest mountains in Europe and delivered it into the heart of Italy. Where it remained was smaller but hardened by unimaginable suffering. Rome had expected to fight in Spain or Africa. Instead, Hannibal had brought the fight to their doorstep. North and south, the sea hems you in. You have not a single ship even to escape in to save your life. Facing you is the Po, behind you is the Alpine barrier, which even in the flower and freshness of your strength, you almost failed to cross. You must conquer or die. According to Livy, this was the speech Hannibal had for his men after they had crossed the Alps. This is not meant to make Hannibal seem hard-hearted but pragmatic, as this was indeed the reality of the situation. For Hannibal and his men, there was only one path left: forward. Hannibal's words were more than just a warning to his men. They were also a promise. They had come through the impossible, and now, if they held firm, Italy itself was within their grasp. But his army, battered, fewer than 30,000 soldiers remained, and if they were to face Rome, they were going to need reinforcements. Here Hannibal turned to one of his greatest weapons, psychology. The Celtic tribes of northern Italy, the Insubres and the Boii, had long hated Roman rule. Rome had taken their lands, imposed colonies, and humiliated them in war. Hannibal presented himself not just as an invader, but as a liberator, come to break Roman power. He paraded his war elephants before them, a terrifying and exotic display the few in Italy had ever seen. To the Celtics, it seemed as though the gods themselves marched with Hannibal. But persuasion alone was not enough. Hannibal understood the power of spectacle. To drive home the reality of their situation, he staged a grim contest between two captured Celtic warriors. They were told to fight to the death. The victor would walk free, laden with spoils. The loser would receive a different kind of freedom from life itself. Before the assembled soldiers, the captives fought with savage desperation. When it was over, Hannibal turned to his men and reminded them, "The courage of those who despair of safety will carry everything before it. Better to fight and die free than to live as a slave who would never see home again." Then he made an even bolder statement. He turned on the Teruni, a small tribe loyal to Rome. Their chief town was stormed and destroyed, their people slaughtered. It was a brutal warning to those who sided with Rome would share the same fate as the Teruni. The message was clear and it worked. Soon, the Insubres and the Boii riled with him, and other Celtic tribes followed. With new warriors flooding into his camp, supplies brought by allies and local guides joining his cause, Hannibal's battered army transformed into a force once again capable of challenging Rome. He had not only crossed the Alps, he had turned Italy's own people against Rome, and with his ranks replenished, he was ready for his first clash with the legions on the plains of the Ticinus River. In 218 BC, the Roman consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, father of the man who would later be called Scipio Africanus, led his cavalry out to scout Hannibal's forces. Hannibal, always a step ahead, anticipated this move. He marched swiftly to intercept with his own cavalry and skirmishers, eager to test Rome's strength. The battle was fast and brutal. Roman cavalry charged, but Hannibal's Numidian horsemen swarmed their flanks. The Numidian, the finest light cavalry of the age, darted with javelins, wheeled away, then struck again, cutting through Roman discipline. The Romans were outmaneuvered, their lines broken. Publius Scipio himself was badly wounded, his life saved only when his teenage son, the future Scipio Africanus, rode into the fray and pulled him to safety. Though small in scale, the Ticinus River proved a point. Hannibal could defeat Rome's cavalry with ease, and he was already inside their head. He had not come to Italy to hide behind walls or wait for Rome to strike. He would seize the initiative, dictate the terms of battle, and show his men the victory over Rome was possible. The defeat at the Ticinus River shook Rome. Though only a small engagement, it was their first clash with Hannibal on Italian ground, and he had bloodied them badly. Even worse, he had exposed the weakness of Roman cavalry against his swift Numidian horsemen. The Senate reacted quickly. Publius Scipio, still recovering from his wounds, withdrew to regroup with his colleague, Fabius Africanus Longus marched north with a fresh army. Together they fielded nearly 40,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry. On paper, Hannibal's forces, around 20,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry and a handful of elephant, was badly outnumbered, but numbers meant very little to Hannibal. At the Trebia River in December 218 BC, Hannibal prepared the ground for victory. The weather was bitterly cold, icy rain soaking the fields and the sleet lashing the soldiers. At dawn, he sent his Numidian cavalry to ride up the Roman camp and provoke them. The hot-tempered Cyprianus took the bait. He ordered his entire army across the freezing river, forcing his men to wade chest-deep through icy water without breakfast or rest. By the time they reached the fair bank, they were shivering, hungry, and half numb with cold. Hannibal's army, meanwhile, had eaten already, warmed themselves by the campfire, and were waiting. As the Romans formed up, Hannibal sprang his trap. His cavalry, superior in both numbers and skill, swarmed the Roman flanks, while his elephants thundered into their infantry, breaking their formation. At that moment, Hannibal's brother, Mago, struck from hiding, leading 2,000 men in a surprise attack against the Roman rear. What had begun as a confident Roman assault turned into a slaughter. Thousands were cut down, many more drowned in the icy waters of the Trebia as they tried to escape. By nightfall, a Roman army nearly twice as Hannibal's size had been destroyed. Hannibal had done more than win a battle. He had humiliated Rome, showing that superior numbers and brute force meant nothing against cunning and preparation. It was his first great victory in Italy, but not his last. After Trebia, Rome sent their new consuls, Servilius and Flaminius, to block the two main paths south into Italy. Rome thought this would buy them enough time to recover from their losses, but Hannibal refused to give them that luxury. Instead, he made one of the boldest decisions of his career. He would lead his army through the flooded swamps of the Arno River. The choice was daring but brutal. The Romans had blocked the direct routes, and the marshes offered Hannibal a way to outflank them and strike deeper into Italy. The cost, however, was terrible. For 4 days and 3 nights, the army waded through waist-deep and at times neck-deep, stagnant water. The mud sucked at their legs, supplies rotted, and pack animals drowned in the mire. There was no solid ground to camp on, no fires to be lit, no rest to be found. Men slept standing, leaning on their shields, while horses collapsed from exhaustion. The water was foul and disease-ridden, and the stench of death lingered as animals and men alike perished in the swamps. Hannibal, who marched on foot alongside his soldiers, suffered terribly himself. An infection in his eye, made worse by the damp and filth, made him permanently blind on one side. Yet, even half blinded, he never stopped pressing forward. To maintain order, Hannibal placed the Celtic allies at the center of the column. The Celts were fierce fighters but volatile and unreliable, and Hannibal feared they might desert if given the chance. Hemmed in on all sides by Iberians, Libyans, and cavalry, they had no choice but to endure the same horrors as everyone else. The price was heavy. Many men and animals perished in the swamps. The elephants fared poorly in the muck, and most were lost. Some later argued that Hannibal may have deliberately chosen this path, reasoning being that the hardship would purge his army of the weak and only leave the strongest to face Rome. Whether or not this was his intent, the survivors who emerged from the marshes were hardened to the core. Once on dry ground, Hannibal wasted no time to replenish supplies and restore his men's strength. He unleashed them on the fertile lands of Etruria. Roman farms burned and villages were looted, and Hannibal's army feasted on the wealth of Roman soil. The march had costed him dearly, but it also placed him exactly where he wanted to be. Deep in Italy, his army bloodied and Rome humiliated once again. The march through the Arno River had left Hannibal's army battered but hardened. Now he set his sights on Rome's new consul, Gaius Flaminius. Flaminius was bold and reckless, eager to win glory by striking Hannibal quickly. Hannibal knew it, and he prepared to exploit it. Hannibal advanced into Etruria, burning farms and villages along the way. This wasn't random plunder, it was bait. He wanted Flaminius eager and desperate to fight, and careless enough to fall into a trap. Flaminius took the bait. With his army of 30,000, he pursued Hannibal without caution, ignoring scouts and marching straight into the jaws of the Carthaginian trap. The battlefield chosen by Hannibal was Lake Trasimine, a narrow valley where the road hugged the shoreline with wooded hills rising steeply above. Here Hannibal arranged his forces in silence. He placed his infantry in the hills hidden by the trees, with his cavalry and skirmishers concealed further along the slopes. Commanding part of the ambush was his younger brother Mago Barca, ensuring that when the trap was sprung, it would snap with deadly precision. At dawn, Flaminius marched his column into the valley, chasing Hannibal's vanguard. Romans, stretched out along the road, had no idea what waited above them. Then, on Hannibal's signal, the hills exploded with war cries. Thousands of Carthaginians poured down from all sides, crashing into the Roman column. The Romans had no time to form lines or even draw up properly. Trapped between the lake on one side and the hills on the other, they were slaughtered where they stood. Chaos reigned, and men drowned in the lake trying to escape. Others were cut down in the crushed battle. Flaminius himself was killed in the fighting, his body trampled underfoot. By the end, the Roman army was annihilated. As many as 15,000 were killed and thousands more captured, and not a single man escaped without a loss. It was the largest ambush in military history, and Hannibal had orchestrated it flawlessly. At Trasimine, Hannibal's genius was on full display. He had lured in an overconfident council into battle, chosen the perfect terrain, and unleashed destruction with precision and timing. The disaster at Lake Trasimine sent shockwaves through Rome. 2 Roman armies had already been destroyed in less than a year, tens of thousands dead, and 1 council killed in battle. Panic gripped the city. For the first time in the war, the Senate appointed a dictator, Quintius Fabius Maximus. His mission was clear: stop Hannibal, or at the very least, keep Rome alive. But Fabius knew something the others did not. Hannibal was too dangerous to face head-on. Rome's pride demanded open battle, but Fabius saw that Hannibal thrived off that pride. So he chose a different path. Avoid direct engagement, shadow Hannibal's movement, cut off his supplies, and bleed him slowly. It was a strategy of delay, and it earned him the nickname Fabius the Delayer. Hannibal, however, knew how to turn every caution into a weapon. As he marched through Italy, he unleashed his men to burn and pillage the countryside, destroying villages and farms. The land itself became a weapon, every column of smoke a reminder that Rome could not protect its people. But there was one exception. The estates of Fabius Maximus were left untouched. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. By sparing Fabius' property, Hannibal planted the seed of doubt in the Roman mind. Was their new dictator secretly in league with him? Was the strategy of delay really caution or treachery? Fabius, already unpopular for refusing to fight Hannibal directly, suddenly found himself accused of cowardice or even betrayal. In reality, Fabius' delaying tactics worked. They kept Hannibal contained, denying him an easy victory, but Hannibal had shown once again that his genius extended beyond the battlefield. He knew how to turn Roman pride, fear, and politics against itself. Rome might resist him with swords, but he was just as willing to fight them with shadows and suspicion. By 216 BC, Rome had had enough of the humiliation. Hannibal had destroyed armies at Trebia and Trasimine, and Fabius' cautious delays, though effective, were deeply unpopular. Rome's pride demanded a decisive battle. The Senate raised the largest army in its history, nearly 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, and gave command to 2 consuls, Gaius Tyrannus Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Their goal was simple: crush Hannibal in one overwhelming blow. Hannibal's force was barely half the size, around 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. Outnumbered nearly 2 to 1, he knew that if he stood in a straightforward fight, Rome's sheer weight would prevail, but Hannibal had no intention in fighting straightforwardly. On August 2nd, on the dusty plains near the village of Cannae, Hannibal prepared the trap that would become a legend. He placed his weakest troops, the Gauls and the Spaniards, at the very center of his line. Deliberately arranged in a shallow crescent, the bulged outwards towards the Romans. On either side, he placed his strongest African infantry, waiting in tight formations. His cavalry, included the superb Numidian horsemen, was positioned on the wings. When the battle began, the massive Roman infantry advanced, pushing hard against Hannibal's center. As he intended, his Gauls and Spaniards gave ground slowly, step by step, drawing the Romans further in. The Roman army pressed forward eagerly, convinced they were breaking Hannibal's line. Then, the trap snapped shut. The Carthaginian center continued to bend and fall back, but the African infantry on the flanks pivoted inward like a giant gate closing. At the same time, Hannibal's cavalry, having smashed the Roman horse on the wings, swung around and struck from behind. The Romans were now surrounded on all sides. Trapped in a tight ring of steel, 80,000 men were compressed into a killing field with nowhere to escape. The slaughter that followed was staggering. As many as 50,000 Romans were killed in a single day. Another 10,000 were captured. It was the worst defeat in Rome's long history. Cannae was Hannibal's masterpiece, the perfect double embellishment, a maneuver so devastating that is still studied in military academies today. Against impossible odds, Hannibal had destroyed the largest army Rome had ever fielded. The fields of Cannae were drenched in Roman blood. An army of 80,000 had been reduced to ruin. In Rome, panic reigned. The Senate prepared for the worst. Women mourned in the streets, and the city braced itself for siege. Never before had Rome suffered such a catastrophe. But Hannibal did not march on Rome. Instead, he rested his army and consolidated his new position in southern Italy. To many, this decision seemed unthinkable. His cavalry commander, Hannibal, is said to have told him, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but not how to use it." Yet, the reality was more complicated. Hannibal's army, though victorious, was exhausted after hours of relentless fighting. He had no siege equipment, no supplies for a prolonged blockade, and no reinforcements from Carthage. The city of Rome, with its massive walls and reserves, would have been a far harder target than the field armies he had just destroyed. Hannibal knew this and chose not to gamble everything on an assault that might fail. Instead, Hannibal played the long game. He set out to break Rome not by storming its walls, but by tearing away its allies, and in this, Cannae achieved exactly what he wanted. The shock of Rome's defeat sent waves through Italy. Many southern cities, including Galpa, the largest city in Italy, defected to Hannibal's side. Others wavered, questioning whether Rome could truly protect them. Even abroad, the effects were felt. Carthage sent reinforcements, Macedonia allied with Hannibal, opening the threat of war in Greece. The victory at Cannae rippled across the Mediterranean, convincing Rome's enemies that the Republic might finally be mortal. But inside Rome itself, something extraordinary happened. Instead of collapsing, Rome steeled itself. The Senate refused to negotiate with Hannibal, councils were elected, armies raised, and even slaves armed if necessary. Rome would fight on, no matter the cost. Cannae was Hannibal's greatest triumph, and yet, paradoxically, it was also the moment that revealed the true resilience of his enemy. He had shattered Rome's armies, but not Rome's will, and that will would prove far harder to defeat than any legion. After Cannae, Hannibal roamed Italy at will. Cities defected to him, and Rome's allies trembled. Yet the one prize he needed the most, Rome itself, remained defiant. The Senate refused negotiations. They rebuilt armies, recalled Fabius the Delayer strategy, and forbade any rash engagements with Hannibal on open ground. It became a war of attrition. Hannibal struck wherever he could, burning fields, seizing supplies, and trying to draw Rome into battle. Yet the Romans avoided his traps. Instead, they targeted his allies, retaking city after city, cutting away at his base support. Hannibal could win victories, but Rome could replace its losses. Carthage, on the other hand, was far less committed. For years, Hannibal sent pleas back home, demanding reinforcements, siege equipment, and money to sustain the war, but the Carthaginian Senate, divided and cautious, gave him only token support. They feared risking everything on one man's campaign. Hannibal was left to fight a giant alone, with nothing but his wits and what resources he could seize in Italy. Meanwhile, his brothers tried to bring him aid. Hasdrubal Barca, commanding in Spain, marched to join Hannibal with reinforcements, but in 207 BC, the Romans intercepted him at the Ticinus River. Hasdrubal's army was destroyed, and Hasdrubal himself was killed. The Romans threw his severed head into Hannibal's camp, a brutal message that no help was coming. His other brother Mago later attempted to reinforce him from Liguria, but Mago too was defeated and mortally wounded before he could reach Hannibal. One by one, Hannibal's family fell, leaving him isolated in Italy. By now, the war had turned. Rome had adapted. They carried the fight to Spain, where Scipio Africanus systematically dismantled Carthaginian power. With Spain lost, Hannibal's lifeline of men and money was gone. Then Scipio struck at North Africa itself, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal after 16 years in Italy. Hannibal had won every battle worth remembering, but without support, without reinforcements, and with Rome's relentless resilience, even his genius could not break the Republic. By 202 BC, the balance of the war had shifted. Hannibal, after 16 years of campaigning in Italy, had been recalled to defend Carthage itself. Waiting for him was Polybius Cornelius Scipio, the Roman, who had turned the tide of the war. Scipio was no ordinary commander. As a young man, he had fought at Cannae and survived the slaughter. Unlike most, he had studied Hannibal's methods, learning from Rome's humiliations. In Spain, Scipio dismantled Carthage's empire piece by piece, defeating Hannibal's brothers and seizing control of Iberia. Now, he had brought the war to Africa, forcing Carthage into a desperate final gamble, recalling Hannibal to face him in battle. The two greatest generals of their age met at Zama, just south of Carthage. Hannibal, now in his mid-40s, commanded around 50,000 men and 80 war elephant. Scipio fielded a smaller army, roughly 35,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry, but he had a decisive advantage. His cavalry, reinforced by Numidian horsemen who had once served Hannibal, now fought for Rome under King Massinissa. Hannibal, once master of the cavalry, had lost his edge. Before battle, the two men met in person. Hannibal, the seasoned veteran, and Scipio, the ambitious rising star, spoke face to face. Both knew that this would decide not just the war, but the fate of Carthage itself. When diplomacy failed, the armies prepared for war. Hannibal opened with his elephants, driving them forward to shatter the Roman lines. But Scipio had prepared for this. He ordered his men to open corridors in the ranks, allowing the elephants to pass harmlessly through, while skirmishers harassed them. Many of the beasts turned in panic, trampling Hannibal's men. Next came the infantry. Hannibal's front ranks of mercenaries and levies clashed with Rome's legions. At first, the battle hung in the balance. Hannibal had held back his veteran soldiers, survivors of the long Italian campaigns, as a final reserve. When he unleashed them, the fighting became savage and desperate, neither side giving ground. But then came the decisive blow. Scipio's cavalry, commanded by Massinissa, returned from chasing Hannibal's horsemen off the field. They struck the Carthaginian rear just as the infantry locked in combat. Surrounded, Hannibal's men were crushed in a mirror image of the trap he had once sprung at Cannae. Carthage was defeated. Hannibal, for the first time in his career, was beaten in open battle. The Second Punic War was over. Rome imposed harsh terms. Carthage surrendered its fleet, paid crushing indemnities, and lost its empire. Hannibal had come closer than anyone in history to destroying Rome. At Cannae, he had shown what his genius could achieve, but at Zama, Rome proved that it could learn, adapt, and endure. And in Scipio, Rome had found its own Hannibal, a commander forged in defeat who rose to victory. Hannibal returned home, not as a conqueror, but as a defeated commander. Yet his reputation was so great that even his enemies respected him. Years later, after both men had retired from battle, Hannibal and Scipio are said to have met at Ephesus. According to legend, Scipio asked Hannibal who he considered the greatest general in history. Hannibal named Alexander the Great first, Furius of Epirus second, and himself third. Surprised, Scipio asked where Hannibal would have placed himself if he had won at Zama. Hannibal replied, "Then I would have placed Hannibal before all." Whether the conversation happened exactly this way or not, it captures the mutual respect between these two men. Scipio had learned from Hannibal, and Hannibal had found in Scipio an opponent worthy of him. Defeat did not end Hannibal's story. After Zama, he returned to Carthage and entered politics, rising to become a suffect, the city's highest magistrate. There, he pursued reforms, cutting corruption and streamlining Carthage's finances to pay off Rome's crushing enmities faster than expected. But his success made him dangerous. Pro-Roman factions in Carthage and Rome itself feared his influence. Soon, Rome demanded his exile. Hannibal fled east, becoming a wandering statesman and advisor to kings. He aided Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire in his war against Rome, though his advice was often ignored. Later, he served other rulers, always hounded by Rome's diplomats who demanded he be handed over. In the end, Hannibal found himself cornered. Around 183 BC, at the court of King Perseus in Bithynia, Roman envoys once again came to arrest him. Old, haunted, and unwilling to be paraded as a Roman captive, Hannibal chose his own fate. He took poison, saying, "Let us relieve the Romans of their long anxiety, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death." With that, Hannibal Barca, the man who had brought Rome to the brink of destruction, who had once marched over the Alps, crushed armies, and haunted the Republic for decades, was gone. Yet his legacy endured. Rome never forgot him. Military leaders for centuries studied his campaigns, from Frederick the Great to Napoleon. He had not destroyed Rome, but he had proved that even the greatest empire could be shaken to its core by the genius and the will of a single man. Love stories and sad movies never moved me, but something about the stories of great warriors and generals always bring me close to tears. Hannibal's story holds a special place in my heart because it represents the life of a man who achieved the impossible and changed the very nature of warfare. And yet, as much as I respect him, I can't help but to feel relief that he didn't succeed in destroying Rome. If he had, history as we know it, and perhaps our very existence, would be unrecognizable today. Still, it makes you wonder, what would our world look like if Hannibal had crushed Rome once and for all? But there's also something deeper here. Hannibal's campaigns, for all its brilliance, was born from hate. A vow made by a child in the temple of Baal. And something tells me that God had a role in all of this. Perhaps through divine intervention, Hannibal was never able to besiege Rome. Perhaps it simply wasn't in God's plan for one of Baal's greatest soldiers to destroy the state that one day would become the cradle of Christianity. And maybe that's why his campaigns could never fully succeed. Rome, for all of its flaws, was driven by the belief in destiny and growth and survival. Hannibal's genius was unmatched, but in the end, hate alone was not enough to change the course of history. And boom! That was Hannibal for you guys. Once again, if you guys did enjoy the video and would like to support me and my channel, the best way you guys can do that is by buying some merch at Fighting Philosophy That Shop, or by subscribing to my Patreon. I don't have any extra content on there yet, but you know what I'm saying? I was like, I put so much work into this video that I realized I might as well put on extra ways for you guys to support me. And as always, make sure you guys like, subscribe, share the video with your grandma or something, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Hannibal, who marched on foot alongside his soldiers, suffered terribly himself, an infection in his eyes. Why am I laughing, dude? This is fucked up. Hannibal, who marched on foot alongside his soldiers, suffered terribly himself.